In the early hours of Valentine's Day 2000, a 9-year-old girl was seen walking down a highway. The witness made a U-turn to double-check what he had seen. Was it really a child walking by herself in the middle of the night? But before he could get a good look, the child, spooked by his approach, ran off into the darkness, never to be seen again. Just a few hours later, a mother went to wake her 2 kids for school, but her 9-year-old daughter wasn't in her bed. Where was she, and why did she run off into the night? Or did she even leave the house at all? Please subscribe to the channel. The more subscribers we have, the more content we can put out. Asha Degree was just 9 years old when she went missing, and to this day she hasn't been found. Her parents were Aquila and Harold, and her brother O'Brien was just a year older than Asha. They lived in a duplex on Oakcrest Drive near Shelby, North Carolina. It was a small home with 2 bedrooms, so Asha and O'Brien shared a room. They were typical latchkey kids and would come home from school together, let themselves inside and do their homework while their parents were still at work. Harold was a dock loader, and Aquila worked at a piano factory. Asha was into science and sports. She liked basketball and played as a point guard for her school's team. Aquila described Asha as shy, responsible, and wary of strangers. She was also scared of dogs and storms. She loved her family, especially her brother, who she considered her best friend. Asha was not the type of girl to get into trouble. In fact, she was well behaved, often timid, and quite happy to stay at home. Many of Asha's aunts, uncles, cousins, and her grandmother lived on the same street, so Asha was frequently around family. Friday, February 11th was a day off school, so Asha and O'Brien spent the day at their aunt's house nearby and had basketball practice in the afternoon. The next day, Asha and O'Brien both had basketball games they played in. Unfortunately, Asha fouled out of the game and her team lost. She was very upset about it and possibly felt responsible for her team losing. According to the Star newspaper, Asha said her leg hurt, but her mother thought she was faking and told her that she wasn't really hurt. According to Chad Wilson, Asha's coach, Asha later admitted she wasn't really hurt, and then perked up. He said, "All the girls were crying, not just Asha, and then they had a good cry afterward because it was the first loss. Just a few minutes later, she was up smiling and joking and having a good time. I sat behind her for part of the boys' game and tossed a towel over her head and joked with her. She didn't show any behaviour or say anything that led me to believe that she was unhappy. We joked like we normally do, and she was very happy when sitting with her mother. The family is a loving family, and her parents are just great. They are always at the games cheering both kids on." That night, Asha went to a slumber party at her 15-year-old cousin's house. They stayed up later watching TV. Not much information is available about this slumber party, and we don't know all of the activities or who exactly attended, but there are reports that around 12 girls spent the night. The next day at 10 a.m., the family went to church at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church in Waco. After church, they went to Harold's sister's house for lunch, where Asha's grandmother gave her perfume and candy for Valentine's Day. The candy was some of Asha's favourite, cinnamon discs. The family arrived home later that day, and Asha was so exhausted from a full weekend that she fell asleep around 6:30 p.m. There was a thunderstorm outside, and it was raining heavily. According to Aquila, Asha was scared of storms, and it woke her up. So she joined her mum and brother in the den to watch TV. They were watching a basketball game. Harold may have been at work at this time, but it's unclear. Just before 9 p.m, a vehicle crashed into a utility pole, knocking out the power in the area. As a result, Aquila didn't make the kids bathe before sending them to bed and decided they would do it in the morning. After the kids had gone to bed, Harold arrived home. Aquila and Harold's anniversary was the next day, Valentine's Day. At 11:30 p.m, Harold made a late-night trip to a store to get Valentine's candy. Where exactly he went is unclear, since the family lived in a quiet, almost rural area. Harold returned home 30 minutes later and fell asleep on the couch, only to be awoken by Aquila asking him to turn off the kerosene lamp before coming to bed. At this point, the power had come back on, and Harold, now awake, checked on the kids and then watched TV until around 2:30 a.m. He checked on the kids once more and then went to bed himself. At around 2:30 a.m, O'Brien said he heard Asha get up and go to the bathroom, but then she came back to bed. At some point afterwards, he heard squeaking and movement from Asha's bed, but didn't think much of it. He said, "I thought she was tossing around in her sleep. She would have told me if she went somewhere." It is unfortunate that O'Brien noticed Asha get up to go to the bathroom, but didn't notice her get up again when she left the house. Clearly he's a light sleeper if some bed squeaking woke him up in the middle of the night, but perhaps this bed squeaking was Asha leaving and he didn't realise. Aquila's alarm went off, and just before 6:30 a.m, she went to wake the kids for school. To her horror, Asha wasn't in her bed. She checked around the house but couldn't find her. She noticed that Asha's book bag and house key were missing. Aquila informed her husband, who wondered if Asha had gone to his mother's house across the street. So Aquila called there, but her mother-in-law hadn't seen Asha. Panicked, Aquila ran outside and called out Asha's name, but she was nowhere to be found. At 6:39 a.m, Harold called law enforcement and they arrived just a few minutes later. There are some inconsistencies with this timeline, which we will look at later in the video, but for now, let's continue. A K-9 unit was on the scene, but according to Mark Davis, retired sergeant from the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, the dogs tracked Asha's scent from the backyard to the highway, but then the dogs lost the scent. After hearing about Asha on the news on his lunch break, a truck driver named Jeff Rupp called police to tell them what he saw last night. According to Rupp, at around 3:45 a.m, he saw a small person walking on Highway 18 wearing a white shirt, possibly a nightshirt, white pants, and white sneakers. He is quoted in the Charlotte Observer, dated February 17th, as follows. "I seen a little girl walking down the road with her book bag. She had on a little dress and white tennis shoes, and her hair was in pigtails. I went back, but she never did look up at me. She looked like she knew where she was going. She was walking at a pretty good pace." Rupp said after he passed her on the highway, he turned his vehicle around to get a better look and confirm what he saw. But the girl didn't look at him as he passed her once again, and as he resumed his route, he saw her run off the highway next to a field owned by the Turners. This was about a mile heading south away from her house. Investigators had Rupp show them where the girl ran off to, and again, dogs couldn't find her scent. According to Rupp, he was so confused at seeing a child walk down a highway by herself in the middle of the night that he circled her 3 times, but he wasn't concerned enough to call police. In 2000, cell phones were not common, but payphones were, and they were located at most gas stations, truck stops, and convenience stores. But Rupp didn't stop to report what he saw until he heard about Asha's disappearance the next day. Some people wonder where he turned his truck around, since it was a 2-lane highway without a shoulder or any kind of pull-off area. But Rupp was driving his personal vehicle at the time, not a big rig, so if he wanted to make a U-turn, he could have. But Jeff Rupp wasn't the only person who claimed to have seen Asha that night on Highway 18. Roy Blanton Sr. and his son, Roy Blanton Jr., were driving on Highway 18 and saw someone matching Asha's description at about 4:30 a.m. Roy Sr. said he thought it was a woman in some kind of domestic situation. He said, "It was a small figure wearing light-coloured clothing. I thought it was a woman. I couldn't tell if it was a child. I thought that maybe it was a domestic violence thing, where a woman left the house and was out walking." After the sighting, Roy got on the CB radio and warned other truckers that there was a person on the highway. But Roy didn't report the sighting to the police until the afternoon of Wednesday the 16th. Meanwhile, Jeff Rupp had taken a polygraph test and passed. The area that Rupp said he saw the girl run off to became the focus of the search. The land was owned by Charles Turner, and the Turners had a furniture upholstery business. About 600 feet from the road was a shed where the Turners kept old furniture. The shed was up a hill, and in complete darkness it would not have been an easy walk, though there was a light on the outside of the shed which might have guided someone walking there. But no footprints of Asha's were found leading to it. After the heavy rains earlier that night, it's likely the grass would have been muddy. However, something of Asha's was found inside the shed. Debbie Turner discovered a yellow plastic hair bow, a marker, a pencil with Atlanta written on it, and cinnamon disc candy wrappers next to a tractor. She initially thought it was just some trash, but gave the items to police when they came by on Thursday. The Degree family said that the items belonged to Asha, and they recognized the pencil as the white 1996 Olympics pencil that Asha got a year earlier during a family get-together in Atlanta. Chad Wilson, Aisha's basketball coach, was also certain that the items belonged to Aisha. He said, "When I saw the bow, I said, that's hers, I'm sure of it." "What that pencil tells me is there is renewed hope, now that we know that she left the road," said Sheriff Dan Crawford. "That pencil is unique to her, and her parents told my detectives that the items belong to her." But surprisingly, there was none of Aisha's fingerprints or footprints in the shed at all, and police dogs didn't pick up Aisha's scent there. There was no disturbance of the dusty dirt floor either. However, it's important to note that there were so many people on the scene that it may have been difficult for the dogs to pick up her scent. Another item that was discovered on the Turner property was perplexing. It was a photograph of another young girl, similar in age to Aisha, but the girl in the photo wasn't Aisha, and nobody knew who she was. What connection did she have with Aisha? But there might not have been a connection at all, since we don't know how close to Aisha's items it was found. The Turners have said that it wasn't uncommon for photos and other items to fall out of old couches that they fixed up, so the photo may have nothing to do with Aisha. By Friday, there were 100 people searching for Aisha around the Turner shed, and 500 people searching for her in total, but nothing else was found. During interviews with Aisha's classmates, some of them told police that Aisha showed them some money in her purse, but Iquilla said she doesn't know where that money would have come from. The following week, a neighbour of the Turners, who owns the yard behind the shed, was interviewed by media and said that his 6 beagles that he kept in the yard usually bark if anyone comes near them, but on the night of Aisha's disappearance, he did not hear them bark. Could it be that the dogs just didn't notice her? Apparently Aisha was deathly afraid of dogs, so if she knew they were there, it's possible she went out of her way to hide from them. But it doesn't make sense that someone so scared of dogs would go somewhere near 6 of them that often barked, so it's more likely Aisha didn't know the dogs were there, or maybe she was never there, and the items don't belong to her. On February 24th, the investigators released to the public the photo of the girl that was found in the shed in the hope that someone would recognize her. Unfortunately, no one did, and she has still not been identified. If Aisha was in the shed and the items belonged to her, why did she also have a photo of an unknown girl? Maybe the photo had nothing to do with her and was left there by someone else. The problem with that is, the Turners would likely have discovered this photo already had it been left previously. 18 months later, on August 3rd, 2001, Aisha's book bag was found 26 miles from her home and in the opposite direction of where the person on Highway 18 was headed. It was discovered just 50 yards from the road. Terry Fleming, a construction worker, was clearing land to build a driveway when he found something double-wrapped in trash bags. He didn't look at it right away, instead continuing to work for several hours. But something about it drew him in, and he eventually opened the trash bag. Inside, he found a beige and black book bag. It was determined that it had been sitting there for quite some time. Whoever discarded it did so long before it was found. We know it was Aisha's because it had her name and phone number written on it. Fleming copied down the name and number but left the bag where it was. The next morning, he showed his wife the name and number, and she immediately recognized the name of the missing girl and they reported it to the police. Fleming said that he had been sworn to secrecy about the contents of the bag, but he did say this: "It was strange enough that I didn't feel comfortable with it. I've run up on a few strange things in my life, but nothing of this magnitude. This is just something that drew my attention. There's a reason for it. This was meant to be. I was drawn to it by a higher power. I'm just a tool here." Police said that 99.9% of the bag's contents were Aisha's, meaning that there was at least one item in there that didn't belong to her. 2 years later, police told the public what 2 of these items were. In 2018, they released images of a book and a shirt. The book was from Aisha's school library in Falston Elementary, but Aisha did not take out the book. The shirt was a New Kids on the Block t-shirt that did not belong to Aisha. The boy band New Kids on the Block broke up 6 years previously, so it's unlikely that Aisha listened to them, but it's possible that one of her older cousins or relatives did. However, if the shirt did belong to one of her relatives, they would have identified them by now. This shirt is quite distinctive, and not one that you would forget owning unless you had it for a very long time. Some people speculate that it belonged to one of the guests at the slumber party. If Aisha's cousin was 15 at the time, it's possible other friends of hers similar in age were also there. Maybe Asha grabbed the shirt by mistake, or maybe she borrowed it and left it in her bag. But again, surely if it did belong to someone close to the family, they would have come forward by now. So whose was it? Perhaps it belonged to another victim of whoever took Asha, and the kidnapper put all the items together in the bag. This could also explain why it was double wrapped in plastic trash bags. Perhaps whoever dumped it wanted to preserve it. Perhaps they wanted to keep trophies from their victims. Perhaps they wanted to fetch the bag at a later point in time. One theory is that whoever dumped it wanted it to be found, and that's why they preserved it. But who would want it to be found? Well, one theory is that at least one of Asha's parents were involved in her disappearance, and they wanted to make it look like she ran away. By preserving her book bag, it would add weight to the theory that she ran away on her own accord. Another point is that the bag was not buried. If someone wanted to keep it as a trophy, it's likely they would have buried it or kept it somewhere safer. By not burying it, it was more likely to be found. On the other hand, the bag could have been wrapped in trash bags to not draw attention to it, to make it look like trash. Maybe it was tossed from a moving vehicle and wasn't intended to be preserved at all. The area it was found contains lots of other garbage, so it would have blended in. If the perpetrator was a local, they could have kept up with the news reports about the disappearance and eventually threw the bag out in a spot they knew the police had finished searching. Perhaps they thought this was a safer way to discard it rather than putting it in a dumpster. Items belonging to Asha that were missing from her house included black overalls with a Tweety bird on it, a white long-sleeved t-shirt, blue jeans with a red stripe, a vest, and her Tweety bird purse, but we don't know if these items were found in the book bag. But according to Aquila, who was interviewed after the bag was found, Asha had packed her basketball uniform. What's interesting is that Asha's coat was not missing. The night she disappeared, she went outside in only her nightshirt. It had been raining heavily that night, and it was cold out. The temperature is reported to have been just above freezing that night, so it's strange that she would not go out in her coat. Testing was done on the book bag, but results were not released to the public. Asha's relatives had mixed feelings about the bag. Asha's cousin, Shalonda Brown, said it gave her extra hope that more may be found to lead to Asha. But her great-aunt said, with the condition and situation of her walking at night, and with the way people are these days, I have doubts. In 2016, the FBI received a tip that Asha may have been seen getting into a 1970s model Ford Thunderbird or a Lincoln Mark IV with rust around the wheel wells. Where and when exactly this sighting occurred is unknown, but detectives thought it had enough substance to release this information to the public. According to the Sheriff's Department, it is a vehicle of interest and was occupied twice on the night Asha disappeared. This phrasing might suggest that someone was seen in the car or driving the car at 2 different times on the night Asha disappeared. It is still unknown when this sighting fits in with other witness sightings that night. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, so it's unlikely she was abducted. If it was an abduction, Asha wouldn't stop to grab her book bag. This means that either Asha never left the house, or she left willingly. If she did leave the house on her own, what was the reason? Aquila said, she was upset after her Pee-wee basketball game lost a game Saturday, but she was better Sunday at church. There's no reason she would just walk off, and she's never run away from home before. We have no idea why she would have gone out or where she would want to go. She wasn't disciplined Sunday, and my son said that nothing was bothering her at home or school. Asha's aunt, Asha Degree, who lives down the street, said, there's no reason for her to be gone. We searched ourselves just after 6:30 this morning but haven't found her. I just hope and pray she's alright. The loss of the basketball game upset Asha, but by all accounts from her family that weekend, she got over it. She was seen playing and having fun afterwards. Sure, this unhappy feeling could have lingered for some time, but would it cause her to run away? When kids run away, it's usually because they are running from something at home, but it could also be for adventure. Kids don't often think rationally and consider how they'll survive in the outdoors, but if she was just going on an adventure, why leave in the middle of the night after a storm? It doesn't seem likely. If she left for a compelling reason. But missing children under 10 are rarely considered runaways. John Goad, director of the North Carolina Center for Missing Persons, citing Asha's age and apparently stable home, said, she doesn't fit any standard profile of a missing child. I don't think a case like hers has ever happened anywhere, anytime. Ben Amini, director of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Missing Children Division, said kids usually don't start running away until age 12. If Asha didn't run away, was she forced to leave the house or taken? One theory is that she was groomed by someone. The Degrees did not have a computer and it was the year 2000, so it's almost impossible she would have been groomed online. If she was groomed, it must have been from someone she had met in person, perhaps at school or church. Asha was 9 years old, so there's very few places she went. Even then, she would not have been alone very often, other than after school when she and her brother got the bus home and waited for their parents to get off work. Could the grooming have happened during this time? Possibly, but again unlikely for a few reasons. According to Iquilla, Asha knew not to open the door for anyone, and if anyone ever did come to the house, O'Brien would have known about it. And if someone wanted to kidnap her, they could have done so after school. They didn't need to make Asha leave the house at 3 a.m. If Asha was groomed, why did the groomer make Asha leave her house in the middle of the night? It seems like a terrible idea, because Asha could have easily woken anyone in the house. But maybe they wanted Asha to meet them somewhere, and they couldn't do it in the daytime when too many people were around. But if that's true, where? Asha was apparently seen walking south on Highway 18 in the opposite direction of her school. She wasn't headed anywhere near where she usually went, and Asha didn't have Google Maps, so how did she know where to go? It was also pitch black. There were a few lights from houses and buildings in the distance, but there weren't many, if any, streetlights or lights on the highway. If you would like to see just how dark it was when Asha was apparently walking that night, check out this video titled Asha Degree The Walk by What Would She Do? In it, a lady makes the mile walk from Asha's house on Highway 18 on February 14th, 2020. The only light she has is from her phone and the car travelling beside her. Asha had neither of these, so it would have been immensely scary and dangerous for her to make that walk. The road does not have a sidewalk either. She would have been walking on the road or off to the side on the grass. Most adults would not do this walk, so would a 9-year-old do it? Asha was known as a nervous child, so she surely would not have wanted to do this walk unless she felt she had no choice. According to Sheriff Dan Crawford, Harold usually worked second shift, finishing work at 11:30 p.m. But on Thursday and Friday, the days leading up to the disappearance, he worked first shift. It's unknown if Harold worked his usual second shift on Sunday when Asha disappeared, or if he even went to work at all. We know he didn't work first shift because he went to church with his family. If he did go to work at his normal second shift, he would have finished at 11:30 p.m, meaning he didn't leave the house at that time to go buy Valentine's candy. He probably bought the candy on his way home from work. But if he didn't go to work that day, then it's possible he did go out at 11:30 p.m. to buy candy. But why would he do this? It's an odd time to go out to buy candy, especially when he would have had to drive to a store. And what store would be open at that time on a Sunday in a rural area? Maybe a gas station. The next day was his and Iquilla's 12-year anniversary, and they planned to spend the day together, so he wanted candy, presumably for his wife. It's not an unlikely story, but the timing of it is a bit odd. He could have waited until the morning. And where is the source of this story, anyway? The only source that reports that Harold went to buy candy that night was Good Morning America, aired on ABC News on September 9th, 2010, a full decade after she went missing. So did it even happen? Well, the news reporter got this information directly from Harold, so it's not hearsay. Whether Harold is telling the truth or not is another matter. Could it be that Harold did not go out to buy candy, but took Asha somewhere? This is speculation, but if Harold did something to Asha, perhaps he grabbed her bag that may have had things in it already from the sleepover. Then he stuffed more clothes in it and put it along with Asha's body in his car and took her somewhere. This might explain why her coat was still at home. If she was already dead, she didn't need it. Perhaps the candy run story is a cover-up for disposing of Asha's body. But Harold also gives us another head-scratcher. The Shelby Star reported that Harold said Asha lay on the couch in jeans and a purple and white Sun Degrees Hot in Atlanta t-shirt until he told her to go to bed at midnight. He then checked on the kids at about 12:30 and they were sleeping. But Iquilla said that she was getting the kids ready for bed around the time the power went out. If this is true, Asha couldn't have been on the couch until midnight. Was Harold confused? Was he remembering a different day? Harold makes a 911 call the morning they discover Asha missing. This call is also a little odd. If you'd like to read the full transcript, it's linked in the description. The first thing Harold says is, "Yes, I'd like to report a child missing." He doesn't say, "My daughter's missing." He says, "a child," which could suggest some distancing. The dispatcher then asks for his address, which he makes a mistake on, then corrects himself. Then after giving his phone number, and without prompting, he says, "The next door neighbour said she went down the road and said she'd just seen a kid down the road." When did the neighbour see a kid? If they just saw a kid, why didn't Harold go to check if it was Asha? But if this child was Asha, it doesn't match with the timings of the witness sightings. It's certainly an odd thing to say because it comes out of nowhere. Perhaps he wanted people to believe Asha left the house on her own. Also, his brother lived next door, so who exactly was this next-door neighbour he was referring to? On the other hand, this was the time that kids were getting ready for school, so perhaps the neighbour did see a child down the road, but it was someone else, possibly on their way to school. But if this is the case, why didn't Harold or someone double-check and make sure that child wasn't Asha? The dispatcher then asks him when he last saw her. "When did you last see her, Harold?" "Last time I went to bed, she was in the bed. We got up this morning, called her to get up to go to school, and she wasn't in there, and her book bag's missing, and her pocketbook." "So you don't know if she got dressed, or if she's still got on her bedclothes, or what?" "We don't know." "Was the door open or anything?" "No, her brother sleeps in there with her, and when he was in there, he didn't hear her when she got up." The dispatcher says they'll get an officer to the house, and the call ends. Harold doesn't seem very emotional in this call, but we don't have the recording to know for sure. He seems matter-of-fact, and not all that worried. In some of her later interviews, Aquila said that she couldn't bathe the kids because the power went out. But if she was putting them to bed between 8 and 8:30, which was their usual school night bedtime, the power was still on at this time. Sheriff Crawford confirmed that the kids went to bed at 8 p.m, so why did she say she couldn't bathe them at that time? Another inconsistency is that on the 23rd year anniversary of Asha's disappearance, Aquila said that her sister-in-law came over for a little while after the power went out. This was never mentioned before. In the same interview, Aquila said she put the kids to bed at 9:30 p.m, then fell asleep herself on the couch and woke up at midnight when the power came back. So we have multiple conflicting stories about the time Asha went to bed, the time the power was out, and who was asleep on the couch. Memories aren't always reliable, but the timeline is important when someone disappears. The Degrees have always been adamant that Asha left of her own free will. Aquila said recently, "The FBI, the police department, and myself agree that she went out of my house of her own free will. She went out of one of my 2 doors. I don't know which one, but she left of her own free will." The language here, "my house" and "my doors," almost make it sound like it wasn't Asha's house too. But it's interesting that the Degrees don't think anyone lured her out. Are they protecting someone? While there are definitely some inconsistencies in their stories, there is no proof whatsoever that anyone in Asha's family had anything to do with her disappearance. But it is worth noting that the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the Degree house the morning they discovered Asha missing was Briscoe, the sheriff deputy. He was a lifelong friend of the Degrees, and he and Harold went way back. They were friends as kids and went to high school together. It's interesting that the Degrees were friends with law enforcement. How willing would Briscoe be to help them make problems disappear is unknown, but it's worth pondering. Sheriff Dan Crawford arrived at the house after Briscoe. Crawford served as sheriff for Cleveland County from 1994 to 2002. By all accounts, he pursued this case hard, but he was adamant from the beginning that the parents weren't involved. After the book bag was found, Crawford said he believed Asha was abducted after leaving the house, but of course, this doesn't explain why she left the house in the first place. It's possible that Crawford had an eye on one of the witnesses, Roy Blanton Sr. Blanton was a truck driver for most of his working career, in addition to serving 13 years as a deputy with the Cleveland County Sheriff's Department. In addition, he volunteered with the Cleveland County school system and was a substitute teacher. While a sheriff's deputy, Blanton ran against Crawford and others for the position of sheriff in 1994 and 1998, but Crawford won both times. Crawford actually fired Blanton in 1996 after Blanton was critical of Crawford, saying that he didn't hire enough minorities. At the time of Asha's disappearance in 2000, Blanton was no longer part of the sheriff's department, and it had been 2 years since he ran for sheriff. He claimed to have seen Asha on Highway 18 and notified other truckers on the radio to watch out for a woman walking on the highway, but he didn't report his sighting until Wednesday, almost 3 days later. So it does bring up the question, did he really see Asha, or was he trying to insert himself into the investigation? It is not unreasonable to think that there might have been some animosity between Crawford and Blanton after the firing and the 2 elections. Crawford believed that Asha was abducted, and maybe he thought Blanton had something to do with it. And there are rumours that Roy Blanton Jr. was friends with Asha's uncle who lived next door to her. Speaking of Roy Blanton Jr., some people think this photo of him posted on his Facebook is him trying to look like Asha. But if we compare it with the famous picture of Asha, the hairstyle is only a little similar. Asha's braids aren't nearly as tight, plus this is a common hairstyle for young girls. But nobody knows what Roy Jr. was trying to say with this post. Whatever his message was, it does come across as strange. Roy Blanton Sr. and Roy Blanton Jr. are both now deceased. Sadly, Sheriff Dan Crawford is also deceased, having taken his own life using a gun at his home in 2015. Why did he do this? Well, we can't possibly know, but in 2003, shortly after Crawford ended his tenure as Cleveland County Sheriff, the FBI began an investigation into a bank account connected to the sheriff's department. More than $70,000 moved through the account over a 5-year period, and the FBI alleged that Crawford intentionally misappropriated government funds. Crawford had written checks to himself from the account, which had money deposited from illegal poker video games and at least 1 drug bust. Other checks were made out for magazine subscriptions, flowers for funerals, and donations to community organizations. Perhaps Crawford's financial matters were one of the reasons he took his life. But there have been several posts on social media from locals or people with connections to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Department that Dan Crawford knew who took Asha and that he wanted to knock on their door and ask them where she was. While Crawford was no longer sheriff when he died, he still very much cared about Asha and wished he could have continued to work on the case. Did Crawford really take his own life, or did someone silence him because he knew too much? There is no evidence to suggest that this is what happened, but the rumour is that the sheriff's department knows a lot more than the public. But if Asha was abducted, who else might it have been? One theory is that the culprit was Asha's uncle, not the one that lived next door, who was Harold's brother, but a different uncle, one that was married to Iquila's sister Janice, but this would make him related to Asha through marriage, not blood. The uncle's name is Joe, and there have been concerns online about his YouTube channel, which has now been removed. In some of his videos, he was filming young women and teenagers, zooming in on them and lingering for long periods. One video was him secretly filming his niece washing his car. He captioned it, "My sexy cool niece cleaning my car." In another video titled Myrtle Beach Barbie Doll, he was covertly filming a woman in a bikini. In the video's comments, he asked if anybody knew who she was and to let him know if they knew her name. There's no denying this behaviour is inappropriate, but there is no proof at all that he had anything to do with Asha's disappearance. He and Janice are both now deceased. There is one more uncle worth mentioning. Iquila's uncle, who was married to her aunt, was sent to prison for allegedly having sex with his second wife's underage daughter. There's not a lot of information about this, but it's worth mentioning because he could have had access to Asha. A lot of news articles and social posts related to this case have been deleted, and since it's an open case, the public don't have access to police files. Therefore, finding accurate information is difficult, but the Degree family still speak to the media about Asha's disappearance, and they still believe she is alive. Cleveland County Sheriff Alan Norman says his team still plans to solve the mystery. He said, "There is movement in the case. It is not a cold case. There's someone in Greater Cleveland County that knows where Asha is, and we are going to continue to aggressively identify you. In order to bring closure to this family that's long overdue, my advice to you would be, you've lived with this long enough, and it's time to cleanse your conscience and come forward before we find you first." What do you think happened to Asha Degree? Leave a comment below.